Hi, I'd like to welcome you to the Westwood Public Library's author series. We are here to welcome Karen Abbott, the author of the Ghosts of Eden Park. She is a New York Times bestselling author of Sin in the Second City, American Rose, and Liar, Temptress, Soldier, Spy. So I'd like to welcome Abbott, and we're here to discuss her new book, like I said, The Ghosts of Eden Park. Welcome.
I'm really happy to be here tonight. Thanks so much, Claire, for having me. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and thanks everybody for coming out tonight and coming out to the to the privacy of your own home with your computer. I usually start talking about how I get my ideas for my books, and I usually get my ideas from dusty old archives or going through libraries and sifting through out of print books and just strolling the shelves and seeing what's there. But I got the idea for this book, for The Ghosts of Eden Park, from a television show. That television show was called Boardwalk Empire. Here's a slide from Boardwalk Empire. It was really quite a fascinating show. It ran on HBO for 5 seasons. And it was really captured the brilliance of the dawn of Prohibition. Bootleggers were just figuring out how to circumvent all of the new laws. Nobody had yet heard of Al Capone. But there was a minor character named George Remus. Here he is, played by the wonderful actor Glenn Fleshler. And if you compare Glenn Fleshler to the actual pictures of Remus, which you'll see, their resemblance is uncanny. But Remus was a minor character in this show. He was very innovative, very strange, very cuckoo, and he even spoke of himself in the third person, as you can actually see by this slide. And just to give you a little bit of context for the slide, George Remus here is on the phone with Steve Buscemi's character. They are wheeling and dealing. Things are getting a little bit heated. And Remus, speaking in the third person, says, "Remus finds you petty and resentful." Steve Buscemi has quite a colorful, not safe for work retort. But it was a lot of fun scenes where Remus was sort of being a little bit batty, but very brilliant. I wondered if George Remus was a real person. And indeed, George Remus was a real person. And I discovered that the real George Remus also did speak of himself in the third person. And he'd said things like, "This is going to be a hell of a Christmas for Remus. So many people want to kill Remus." And my personal favorite was when he said, "Remus's brain exploded." And you would have to read the book to decide for yourself whether or not a brain explosion actually occurred. It's sort of a subjective thing. But he was really the most bizarre and outlandish character I have ever come across in history. And I've kind of specialized in bizarre and outlandish characters in history. And I knew he would just make such an amazing book. His life was much more dramatic and more interesting than anything portrayed on Boardwalk Empire. So before I start talking about George Remus, I just want to take a moment, since you're a library, to tell you about researching George Remus. This is the overhead scanner at the Yale University Law Library in New Haven, Connecticut. I was lucky early in my research to discover that there was a 5,500-page trial transcript relating to Remus at this library in New Haven. And this is the overhead scanner. I had never seen an overhead scanner before. Usually I'm used to scanners where you have to lug the book and you worry about your pages are cut off and you get a hernia by the end of it. But this was about the most amazing, beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. If you have research nerds out there, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. It just sort of copied every page flawlessly. It was a 5,500-page trial transcript. There were about 12 volumes that were this thick. And from morning to night for about a week, I sat there and copied every single page. And when I took it all home, it took me about 4 months to just do nothing but sit there and read every single page of this trial transcript and make notes. And my resulting outline from this research was about 85,000 words, which was almost the length of the book itself. And it had really wonderful details in this trial transcript. One of my favorite details was that George Remus does not like to wear underwear. Apparently that was cause for great alarm in the 1920s. It was apparently the sign of an unsound mind if you did not wear underwear. And there are all kinds of really wonderful glimpses, not only into George Remus's fascinating and really warped mind, but also into 1920s and the way that people were thinking about medicine and society. And there was so much wonderful original source material for this book that's really quite rare to have this much. And it really allowed me to write cinematic scenes And it let me do the thing I really wanted to do, which was to write a whodunit. I wanted to write a nonfiction book where somebody gets murdered, but you don't know who gets murdered until it actually happens. And it's very rare to be able to pull that off in nonfiction. So I was really happy that the research allowed me to do that for this book. And I say that in case anybody has already read the book. If you ask a question, I ask that you not spoil the ending, just so if anybody does want to read it, they can sort of be surprised for themselves. So here's George Remus. How do you solve a problem like George Remus? He was such a fascinating guy. He had kind of a tragic childhood. His family emigrated from Germany to the United States when he was just a child. He wrote about his father being a mean and abusive alcoholic. He had to quit school at a young age 13, in order to support his family because his father was no longer able to work. And he went to work in an uncle's pharmacy, and he really dedicated himself to this job. He called himself a druggist devil boy. He bought his uncle's pharmacy eventually. He opened his own pharmacies. And he decided then that he wanted to apply himself further and become a lawyer. And at night, he would stay over in the pharmacy. He kept a cot in the back room, and he would study for the bar exam. And he also passed the bar exam and very quickly established himself as a renowned and respected Chicago defense attorney. But he also became known for his quite strange courtroom antics. He would leap across the courtroom, he would cry and tear at his hair, and he would attack opposing counsel. They would often end up in a pile of limbs at the bottom of on the floor of the courtroom. His many admirers called him the Napoleon of the Chicago bar. His detractors called him the weeping and crying Remus. But in 1920, George Remus noticed that a new type of man was filling his docket, a new type of client. And this was men who were charged with violating prohibition laws. And he was amazed with the ease with which they paid their fines. They would get arrested, come to his office, slap down a couple $100. He would take care of the business, and they would be back on their way and committing the same exact crimes with no problem. And Remus knew he was much smarter than any of his clients, and he decided that he himself had a chance to clean up. So using his pharmaceutical background and his legal background, he scoured the Volstead Act and he found a loophole. And this loophole was that with a physician's prescription, it was legal to buy, manufacture, and distribute alcohol for quote unquote medicinal purposes. Now, nobody was really using alcohol for medicinal purposes. It was a loophole. Remus, who had quite a way with words, he had a very florid way of speaking, which I'll get to a little bit later on as well. But he called this loophole the greatest comedy, the greatest perversion of justice that I've ever known of any civilized country in the world. So a plan began to take shape in his mind. This is Imogene Holmes. She was a major part of Remus's plan. She met Remus while she was working as a dust girl in his Chicago law office. You know, at night while he was getting, going over files, she would clean up his desk, she would tidy his papers, and they began talking. They began communing about their mutually miserable marriages. Imogene Holmes was a single mother of a young girl. Her husband was never home. He was out spending all their money. And Remus's wife had just filed for divorce. She accused Remus of, quote, having a habit of coming home early in the morning. And I love that that's actually something that was filed on a divorce paper in the 1900s. That's actually, you could actually file for divorce citing that reason. But they fell in love. Imogene and George fell in love. And he began to confide in her. He really trusted her. He knew that she had a smart, savvy mind for business. And I think because they came from similar backgrounds, they both had kind of poor backgrounds, they were struggling, they really got each other. And he started confiding his plans about becoming the country's preeminent bootlegger. He sought her advice. And he even gave her many nicknames. The most important nickname he gave her was the Prime Minister, which sort of gives you an idea of the esteem in which he held her and her business acumen. But Imogene Holmes, meanwhile, only had one nickname for George Remus, and that nickname was Daddy. So that also tells you a little bit about how she viewed him. So George and Imogene Remus leave Chicago in early 1920, and they moved to Cincinnati. It was a very strategic location. 80% of the country's pre-prohibition bonded whiskey was located within a 300-mile radius of Cincinnati. And it was also easy to get by train to other big cities to conduct business with other bootleggers and politicians and what have you. And they bought this wonderful mansion in Price Hill, which at the time was Cincinnati's most prestigious and richest neighborhood. And ironically, they bought this mansion from a from a German brewer who went out of business because of Prohibition. So they bought this mansion. They planned on extensive renovations, and as a gift for his new bride, they got married. Remus put the deed for this home into Imogene's name, and it was one of many decisions that he would come to regret. Imogene, before she got married to Remus, confided to a friend that she wanted to, quote, roll him for his role. So also gives you a little bit of an idea of the design she had on George Remus and his money. This is George Connors. He was a very important person in Remus's business organization. They met soon after Remus moved to Cincinnati. Connors was a politician, a mover and shaker in the area, a real estate guy. And he was the sort of cool, calm, and collected sort, where Remus was volatile and very fiery. They complemented each other very well. And once he had Connors in place, Remus began to implement his bootlegging scheme. And it was a brilliant scheme. It was a 4-part scheme, and I'm going to take you through each part. Number one was to buy distilleries to gain possession of that pre-Prohibition bonded whiskey. The number two was to acquire wholesale drug companies, which would tie into the whole medicinal purposes aspect of this whole shenanigan. Number three was to obtain withdrawal permits that would allow him to remove the whiskey from those warehouses and ostensibly sell it on the legal medicinal market. And number four, this was his true genius, Remus organized his own transportation company. He had men with trucks loaded down with alcohol, ostensibly going to the medicinal market to sell it legally. But other men employed by Remus would hijack those trucks, steal all of the liquor, and divert it to the illegal market at any price Remus named. So basically, George Remus was robbing Remus to pay Remus, and he called this gorgeous, brilliant, unwieldy octopus of an idea the Circle. Within a year of launching the Circle, George Remus owned 35% of all of the alcohol in the United States, which, stop and think about that. That's a staggering figure, 35% of all the alcohol. And he was worth between estimated $20 million and $40 million. Now that's a figure not adjusted for inflation. That is at 1921 money, which is just completely staggering. And the irony of all of this, that George Remus made this complete fortune on bootlegging. He was a teetotaler who had never drank a drop of alcohol in his life. So this is Death Valley. This is the sort of storage area that George Connors found for George Remus. It was a place that was safe from whiskey pirates, which were not pirates of the Ahoy Matey variety, but pirates. Whiskey pirates were these roving bands of thieves who would, descend upon a warehouse, bound and gag all the watchmen, cut the wires, and steal all the alcohol inside. Remus had one too many encounters with these guys and decided to get this distribution and storage center a little bit outside of Cincinnati limits. And all of the rum runners from all around the country would come to Death Valley, and Remus knew how to treat them well. He would give them a cot to sleep on for the night, a hot meal. He even set up craps games, and his favorite customers would get a line of credit that they could pay the next time they came. And it was heavily guarded. There were guards stationed at all the entry points, at all the windows. There was a clerk standing watch at the top of the driveway. You had to know the code to get in. You had to switch your headlights a certain way in order to be allowed entry. And they called it Death Valley in honor of the whiskey pirates who tried to enter but were never heard from again. So it was very successful in keeping out whiskey pirates, but not so good at keeping out federal prohibition agents, as Remus would soon learn. So this is one of my favorite archival finds. This is an actual authentic speakeasy menu from a Chicago speakeasy circa 1925. And you can just enjoy some of these wonderful cocktail names on here. The Dirty Dick Special, the Dirty Dick Flip, the Maiden's Prayer. My personal favorite was the Corpse Reviver, which, as the name suggests, was a hangover cure. You wake up in the morning, you have your Corpse Reviver, you're good to go. And it's just wonderful. The champagne cocktail is 75 cents. Of course, we'll never see a champagne cocktail for that cheap again. But it's just, I just love the fact that this sort of survived this menu from 100 years ago, and just showed you what people were drinking in the speakeasies in Chicago in the 1920s. So here's a picture of George Remus and his mother. Aside from Imogene, Remus's mother was the most important woman in his life. And as you can tell from the picture, he's kind of a mama's boy. And she had also had a very hard life. You know, when she brought her family over from Germany, she was so beleaguered that when she was questioned by immigration officials, she could not remember the names of 4 other children who had died. And Remus always had a special relationship with his mother, and it kind of a bizarre relationship. And I like to tell an anecdote about the two of them, really illustrates this nature of their relationship. According to lore, one night, George Remus's mother and his father, Frank Remus, went out to a Chicago saloon. They got into an argument, and Marie Remus, the mother, bashed her husband's head with a bottle, and he died shortly thereafter from the wound. Now, Remus, wanting to protect his mother and not wanting her to speak indiscriminately to the coroner, locked her in an attic for 3 days until the inquest was over. And it was kind of, to me, indicative of the way that George Remus handled problems, you know, the extremes that he would go to in order to just get something behind him. And locking your mother in an attic for 3 days, I think, is a pretty extreme thing to do. Let's skip this one. So by 1921, George and Imogene Remus had finished renovations on their fantastic mansion. The renovations on this place cost $750,000, which is about $12 million in today's money. There were 31 rooms carefully curated by George and Imogene Remus. There were chandeliers the size of cars, imported rugs and artwork. And as you might guess from the decor in the parlor here, George Remus was not a minimalist. He just kind of threw everything in the room and just whatever would stick. I don't think I ever saw so many naked cherubs and sprigs of holly just tossed around the room. But this was his style. His prized possession was a signed signature, authentic signature of George Washington, which at the time was worth $50,000. But basically, this mansion really just represented George and Imogene's desires to be accepted by Cincinnati society, not just Cincinnati, but across the country. They wanted people to understand who they were. They were people to be reckoned with, and they wanted people to pay attention to them. Here's another room. This is a solarium, a little bit more tastefully decorated, but I thought one of the more striking rooms in the house. And I just kind of love the decor here, the details, especially that thick globe-like lamp there on the coffee table. But like I said, the mansion really was representative of their desire to be respected. And to that end, they decided to throw a New Year's Eve bash at the end of 1921. And here is an actual invitation from that party. I also was amazed to find this in the Delhi Historical Society right outside of Cincinnati. If you can't read the text, it says, our New Year's greeting: dive to health, swim to wealth, float on happiness, 1921, 1922. And considering the level of debauchery that was planned for this party, the mom and the baby don't quite fit. It seems a little incongruous, but Imogene Remus herself designed these invitations, and whatever Imogene Remus wanted, Imogene Remus got. And I love the fact that even the ribbon, even the original ribbon is still there, tattered, but it's still there. And it's just wonderful that this survived. Here is a picture of Imogene Remus in her newly renovated boudoir getting ready for the party. I love the detailing of her dress. I mean, it's just an amazing dress. And I kind of feel sorry imagining the photographer. You know, they hired a professional photographer. And I wonder how many takes he had to do in order to get this perfect shot of Imogene Remus gazing at herself, gazing back out. It just says a lot about who she was in this picture. And, you know, she wanted people to also reckon with her. She was Mrs. George Remus. And they had invited really renowned families to this party. The Tafts, you know, President Taft and his family, the Sintons, judges, politicians, billionaires and millionaires from across the country. I don't know if they have millionaires from across the country. Anyone they could think of that would be prestigious to have at their party, they sent an invitation to. So this was to be the social event of the year. Here, I love this cartoon. You know, newspapers don't do illustrations like this anymore. This is an actual cartoon depiction of what went on at this party. And it's just kind of nicely detailed. There were synchronized swimmers who were raising and lowering out of sight. There were guests using the diving board as a rostrum, giving toasts. Of course, in the middle, there's Imogene Remus in her scantily clad, scandalous one piece, doing a fantastic dive, executing a perfect dive. There were even electric baths, and I had to look up what electric baths were. I'd never heard of them. And electric baths were basically an early version of a tanning bed. They were heated by incandescent lights and said to make the user frisky, which I thought was funny. Although to me, it just sounds like a good way to get electrocuted, but they were a very popular thing in the early 1920s, and they had them at this party. And of course, the big highlight was the swimming pool. It was a Greco-Roman swimming pool with a fantastic garden. Remus christened it the Imogene Baths in honor of his wife. And the other really notable thing about these parties were the favors that George Remus gave out. He gave out, every man received a diamond stick pin, an engraved watch, and every woman received a brand new 1922 car. Of course, this was decades before Oprah. You know, you get a car and you get a car. And also, every single person at the party got a $1,000 bills tucked underneath their dinner plate. That would be the same as if you looked under your chair at home and found $14,000. I don't know if Claire set that up for you, but I'm guessing not, but it was quite extravagant. And in a really elaborate gesture, one that would be remembered with all decades later, George Remus lit his guest cigars with $100 bills. And this is in an era, mind you, when the average annual salary was $1,200. So it's just a really disgusting display of wealth. Here's a picture of the engraved watch that George Remus gave out that night. Wonderful also that this survived. It says from Mr. and Mrs. George Remus, 1921. And it's these lavish parties that are said to, the people believe that F. Scott Fitzgerald was inspired by George Remus in his creation of J. Gatsby and The Great Gatsby. And there are all these apocryphal tales that George Remus and F. Scott Fitzgerald met when the latter was stationed at Louisville during his military service. And there's no hard evidence they met, but I think it's definitely clear that Fitzgerald knew who George Remus was when he was drafting The Great Gatsby. By that time, the entire world knew who George Remus was. And the parallels between George Remus and Jay Gatsby were conspicuous. You know, both men owned a string of pharmacies. Both men had a lavish mansion. They threw elaborate parties. They were both in love with an enigmatic woman. And, Gatsby, as Fitzgerald wrote, sprang from a platonic conception of himself. And I think both men had this sense of melancholy, wanting to inhabit a world that didn't quite welcome them, never feeling like they quite belonged in the place where they wanted to belong. So I never can write a book without a really kick-ass female character. And here she is. This is Mabel Walker Willembrandt. She was such a rich and complicated woman. When Warren Harding appointed her to be the Assistant Attorney General of the United States in 1921, women in this country had only had the right to vote for 9 months. She was only 32 years old, 5 years out of law school, had never prosecuted a single case in her entire career. But suddenly she was in charge of all prohibition cases around the country, thousands and thousands of them, including cases against George Remus. And I'm sure that her crooked bosses at the White House and the Justice Department, from President Warren Harding on down, were just thinking, let's put the little lady in charge. She's inexperienced. She's not going to know what she's doing. She'll be intimidated, and we'll be able to continue our cozy relationship with bootleggers, collecting graft and quid pro quo. And of course, Willembrandt surprised everybody by taking her oath of office in the fall of 1921, and she just pursued everyone. She just started kicking some butt. You can imagine the kind of rampant sexism she dealt with on a daily basis. Newspaper reports would never fail to mention her physical appearance and equating her physical appearance with her personality. Her steely eye showed that she was all about her career, and she didn't care about anything else. And to make matters even more difficult for her, Willembrandt was almost entirely deaf. She had a severe hearing impairment. She spent an hour each morning concealing her hearing aids with her hair. And she just didn't want people to know that she was also dealing with that on top of all the other things that were stacked against her. She was just quite a woman. So right after George Remus's party, a letter lands on her desk from a Cincinnati resident. And it says, all of Cincinnati is well aware that Remus spends lavishly on riotous living, owns no fewer than 40 automobiles, and dispenses enough liquor from his drug companies to meet the prescriptions of physicians of the whole central United States. So the feds in Cincinnati needed her help, and she was going to help them get George Remus. This is Jess Smith. He was also a character on Boardwalk Empire. He worked up the hallway from Willembrandt in the Justice Department. They saw each other every day, but she had no idea what Jess Smith actually did, what his official job was. George Remus knew who Jess Smith was because Jess Smith was Remus's liaison to the federal government. They met often, and Remus paid handsomely for some things that Jess Smith promised to deliver. And there were two things. One was the whiskey withdrawal permits that Remus needed to get the whiskey out of his warehouses to sell it on the illegal market. And the other was legal protection. Jess Smith promised Remus he would not be arrested. If he was arrested, he would not go to trial. If he went to trial, he would not get convicted. If he was convicted, he would not go to prison. If he went to prison, Jess Smith would use his relationship with Willembrandt's boss, Attorney General Harry Doherty, to get him out. So Remus paid about $1 million for all of this over time, and he considered Jess Smith his ace in the hole. But this relationship would not last very long. Dun, dun, dun. Here is a great cartoon really depicting the futility of Willembrandt's job. You know, it's a cartoon where she has a broom and she's literally trying to sweep away an ocean of alcohol. And part of Willembrandt's challenge was the United States itself. You know, we have 2 long craggy borders and 1,800 miles of coastline, all of it unnervingly porous. There were fleets of alcohol coming in from Mexico to Texas, being smuggled under bales of hay. There were fleets of alcohol coming in from Canada, landing on the Michigan Peninsula, guided by searchlights. You know, these things were very well executed and planned. And on a personal level, there were so many inventive ways of smuggling booze. A couple of my favorites I'll share with you. One double amputee boasted that he could hide 36 pints in his prosthetic limbs. There was a soda parlor in Montana that was raided, and they found in the back room a room full of children's squirt guns. And these squirt guns had a 2-drink capacity. They were filled with alcohol. There were liquor-filled torpedoes on Long Island, liquor submarines that raised and lowered out of sight, and seagoing tugs with compartments hiding enough liquor for 30 New Year's Eve parties. And another personal favorite, women were even hiding alcohol inside of their false rubber breasts. They would just put those falsies in there and hide a bunch of booze beneath them. And here's another great one. At first glance, this woman is holding a book titled The Four Swallows by an author named J.B. Corn, a not very subtle reference to John Barleycorn. But if you flip open the top of it, you see that she's actually holding a flask with 4 glass vials in which she can fill with alcohol of her choice, hence the 4 swallows. So this flask was the invention of a Brooklyn-based inventor named John Nuttry. Before Prohibition, he made a name for himself designing little personal coin banks that look like books. And in February of 1921, he decided to get in on the Prohibition craze and decided to patent this little item. And it was a very popular item during Prohibition. Once in a while, you can find them on the auction sites like Worth Point. I found one there once. It was way too expensive for me to have, but it's just, it's an amazing thing. And I wish I did have one. So here's another contraption for smuggling alcohol. You know, at first glance, what is she doing? She's just sipping her coffee in a cafe, having a grand old time, as evidenced by her face. But she's really dumping a bunch of alcohol into her coffee, thanks to her trusty little cane there. This cane was also a very popular item. It screwed apart in the middle, and there was a glass vial hidden inside where you could put your alcohol and just sort of surreptitiously throw it in there. I did get one of these on eBay. It was a reproduction one. But as soon as we're allowed back at bars again, I plan to bring it out as a conversation piece. But clearly, she's very pleased with herself. I think this picture's around 1924. So I like to call this one, My, What a Big Flask You Have. But it's actually called the Bootlegger's Life Preserver, and it was a very, very popular device with women. And I'll tell you why, because believe it or not, back in 1920s, Prohibition agents who were mostly male either were too polite or too nervous to search women. And in some states, it was actually illegal for them to search women at all. They were not allowed to touch women and search them. Women knew this and they took full advantage of it, and they hid alcohol wherever they could, including inside of this enormous Bootlegger's Life Preserver underneath their big fur coats. So this is an interesting thing too I came across in my research. These were called cow shoes. Now, they did not carry alcohol, but they were indispensable to bootleggers who brewed moonshine in forests or meadows, pretty much down south. They were very popular. And as you can see, the heels are carved from wood and made to resemble hooves. And if a moonshiner was being pursued on foot by a prohibition agent, they literally covered his tracks. You know, the prohibition agent would be looking at the ground, looking for some man's shoe prints, but instead would just find a bunch of cow tracks, and the moonshiner would get away. Unfortunately, these are not on eBay. I've checked. I wish they would come back. But here they are. Somebody did get caught. These are modeled by a prohibition agent around 1924. Which brings me to the next part of Willembrandt's challenge, and that was finding good prohibition agents. First of all, there were several impediments to finding good prohibition agents. The average starting salary for a prohibition agent was only $1,200 per year, which was barely a living wage in some parts of the country. There were no qualifications required. You could even have a criminal record. I came upon one story where a prohibition agent was serving time in an upstate New York prison for armed robbery and murder when he got his badge. And Willembrandt wrote about this frustration. She wrote, the dominant reality is that the whole problem is one of getting the right men in places of power and enforcement, men of creative thought, of courage, and those not slaves to political ambition. And by men, I also mean women, lots of them. So this guy became Willembrandt's brightest hope for a good prohibition agent. This is Franklin Dodge. He comes from a very prominent family in Michigan. His father was a politician, a respected lawyer. He got Franklin Dodge his first federal government job, and Willembrandt really latched on to him. She saw that he was ambitious. He was not afraid to go undercover and sort of get information on bootlegger in daring and dangerous ways. And she began calling him her ace of detectives. And she sends him to go after George Remus. Now, Franklin Dodge is good enough at his job that he actually, despite all of Jeff Smith's promises, he actually is able to put Remus in jail. But the two will meet again, George Remus and Franklin Dodge, when George Remus is in prison in the Atlanta penitentiary. Franklin Dodge goes down there to investigate prison corruption. By this time, George Remus had begun hearing rumors about Franklin Dodge. He heard that he was not quite as upstanding and moral as Willembrandt thought. He was amenable to bribes, he accepted quid pro quos, and George Remus wanted to make a deal with him. He wanted to talk to Franklin Dodge and say, hey, I can pay you, I could give you money, and I could also give you information about other bootleggers that you could take to your superiors, and it will make you look good. And in return, I ask that you get me out of jail. So Remus developed this plan, and next time Imogene Remus came to visit her husband in prison, he told Imogene the plan, and he said, I want you to cultivate Franklin Dodge, cultivate him, get him on our side, just cultivate him. So Imogene Remus began cultivating Franklin Dodge, but not quite in the manner that Remus had hoped. So Imogene Remus, by the time she begins this illicit romance with Franklin Dodge, she's about 39 years old. And as I researched this love triangle that develops, I started noticing a common theme. And that was how dangerous flappers were. There was a flapper menace across the country, and the most dangerous flappers, of course, were women who were middle-aged. They were old enough to know better. The New York Times defined a middle-aged flapper as she who does over the old house or builds a new one, where her husband is deposited while she goes out in search of culture. So Franklin Dodge becomes Imogene Remus's culture. She goes out and starts a flamboyant sort of relationship with him, really, really out there, not hiding anything. And to me, it was an interesting theme of the book. You know, women were starting to subvert societal mores and expectations. And what were the consequences of this? I think we can all agree the 1920s were a singularly dynamic, rich time in American history. I don't think this story, George Remus, could have happened in any other decade. You know, we had just finished World War I. The war swept away a lot of gender norms because women had flooded the workplaces. And afterward, America found itself in this sort of in-between period. People were more hedonistic after realizing life could be so short, but the Depression had yet to put a damper on everything. And in terms of women's advancement, many people were not happy that their wives, their sisters, their mothers, their girlfriends suddenly had the right to vote. People were angry about that. So there was a backlash, and the backlash came in the form of attacking flappers, especially the middle-aged flappers. One newspaper condemned them by saying, the woman who finds herself earnestly mimicking the voice, mannerisms, and dress of the poor little flapper girls is a greater menace than the 16-year-old kind. So as for the 16-year-old kind, they had their own culture going, of course. They started a magazine called Flapper Magazine. The tagline, which was great, was "Not for old fogies." And they developed a definition for flapper, which I think needs to make a resurgence. Their definition for a flapper was somebody with a jitney body and a limousine mind, which is just great. And of course, they had their own slang. Here's just page 1 of a flapper dictionary, the A, B's, and C's, just to give you a couple favorites. An anchor was a box of flowers. An Airedale is a homely man. A boob tickler is a girl who entertains father's out-of-town guests, and so on and so forth. They were very popular. The slang became popularized and was sort of analyzed in newspapers across the country. Flappers were even considered to be sexual predators. This cartoon always makes me laugh, just sort of painting these girls as ruining the youth of America. My favorite one is in the middle. It says, unsuspecting boys forced to endure such unseemly exercises as cheek dancing. Cheek dancing! Oh, you know, God forbid they're going to go out and cheek dance. So it was a very dangerous time, clearly, for the youth of America. And there were actually clubs springing up in colleges where males were bonding together, trying to stop this flapper menace. They organized protesting smoking among women who wore flopping galoshes, and the intrusion of women into realms heretofore restricted to men. So this is J. Edgar Hoover. Some people might recognize him, baby J. Edgar Hoover. He's only 29 years old in this picture in 1924 when he was named the director of the Bureau of Investigation, which was the precursor to the FBI. And I love the fact that he would not have gotten that position, director of the FBI, without Mabel Walker Willembrandt. She recommended him for the job. She complimented his superiors and told them to hire him. And they did. They listened to her and they hired him. And I also love the fact that Willembrandt bossed him around. Imagine a woman bossing J. Edgar Hoover around. It's kind of fun to think of now. And you say all you want about J. Edgar Hoover, you know, obviously he did some terrible things before Prohibition and after Prohibition. But during Prohibition, he had one really admirable goal. He wanted to have honest Prohibition agents. He was sincere about this. He didn't want anybody taking bribes. He didn't want anybody accepting quid pro quo. He didn't want anybody but people who were serious about enforcing Prohibition working for him. And he also had begun hearing rumors about one of the agents, Franklin Dodge, Willembrandt's ace of detectives. So he decides to send one of his own agents out to spy on Franklin Dodge. It was sort of a spy versus spy situation. And he realizes that, that Franklin Dodge is having an affair with Imogene Remus, the bootlegger's wife, and he wants to know exactly what's going on. So what does Hoover's agent find? He discovers that that Franklin Dodge and Imogene Remus are gathering Remus's whiskey certificates and endeavoring to sell them, that they are stealing prized possessions from George Remus's mansion while he languishes in jail. And at one point, Hoover's agent literally catches Franklin Dodge with his pants down. It is not often in nonfiction that you have source material that describes somebody being caught with their pants down, but I found it in this book, and it was kind of a fun scene to write just because it never happens in nonfiction. And you know, I like to say that there are so many crazy people in this book that J. Edgar Hoover is actually one of the good guys here, which tells you something. So here's George Remus in prison. At the Atlanta Penitentiary. Do not let his morose expression fool you. George Remus had a multi-room suite at the prison. He was allowed to have Imogene come in and scrub the cell on her hands and knees, which she did. He had his own personal maid. He had his own personal chef. He was allowed to throw dinner parties at a long mahogany table with white linens and fresh flowers with the other prominent bootleggers. It was called Millionaire's Row in the prison. But nevertheless, George Remus was miserable. And George Remus was miserable because he was a control freak. Here he is in prison, and he's hearing rumors about his wife and Franklin Dodge. He's desperate to get out of prison. He keeps wondering what's happening. You know, Imogene will come and visit him, and he just asks her how everything is going. And every time she leaves, he starts sending her more and more unhinged letters. You know, he starts suffering from these brainstorms, he calls them in prison. And he begins writing Imogene these very strange letters. And I mentioned earlier about Remus's florid language, his way with words. And just, if you'll indulge me, I just want to read a quick excerpt of one of my favorite letters that George Remus wrote to Imogene while he was in prison. To the only true and sweetest little girl in the whole dear world, to the apple of my eye, not one, but both. How glorious it feels to know that my sweetheart is cheery again. Little one, you do not know what it means to have you away from me for long. The minutes turn into days, the days into months, and the months into years. I crave you. I would devour you. I care only for you, a human madness. All other matters are infinitesimal against you, and only you. Therefore, you see how I burst into a human cloud, burst with a vitriolic tongue interspersed. My only wife, how is it that you are a monkey, you are a centipede, you are a gem, you are a jewel, you are a combination of all the aforesaid in one? If I but had you there this very moment, I would demonstrate all of the foregoing with a real vigor and vim unexcelled. How about it? I don't know anyone else who uses centipede as a term of endearment, but apparently it was a thing for them. And every time Imogene Remus would come visit him, he would say to her, are you cultivating Franklin Dodge? Are you getting me out of prison? What are you doing? And she would just say to him, don't worry, dear, Franklin Dodge is our friend. So this is Harry Truesdale. This is the professional hitman that Imogene Remus and Franklin Dodge hire to kill George Remus. And it's just a sign of how crazy things get, that this Harry Truesdale, this professional killer, becomes so terrified of both George and Imogene Remus that he thinks they're both going to kill him. He doesn't know which one of them is crazier, more dangerous. And he wants to wash his hands of the whole enterprise because he worries he's the one that's going to end up dead. Just to give you a little taste of how the intense things get. So this is my final slide. This is George Remus's tombstone. He is buried in Riverside Cemetery in Falmouth, Kentucky. And I'll tell you a little story. You could see the missing wings on the angels here. And as the story goes, somebody wrote a letter saying that George Remus, having lived the life that he lived, did not deserve to have angels on his tombstone. The very next day, somebody took a hammer and smashed the angels right off, the wings right off the angels. And this is how his tombstone still looks today. Clearly it needs a bit of a bath, but you can see where the wings are missing. And it's quite a striking image. And I like to end my talk by saying, you know, people who write narrative nonfiction, who do what I do, often lament that we're beholden to the historical record. You know, we're not allowed to make up dialogue. We're not allowed to make up characters. We're not allowed to make up events. But this is the very first time, the Ghost of Eden Park marks the very first time that the dead people did exactly what I wanted them to do. So anyway, thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed the slideshow, and I'm really happy to answer any questions, or if you want to tell me about your own scandalous ancestors, I'm also happy to have some more fodder for some future books.
Abbott, that was great. I can't believe
thank you.
the amount of research you must have done for that book. How long did you work on that book for?
Oh, about 3.5 years. And it actually was one of the shorter books. And I think it's because it was such a condensed, quick narrative, and it was so insular. And that's one of the things I loved about it. You really got in these characters' heads, and the research material let me do that. You know, there were always people talking about what they were thinking, what they saw, what they were feeling, what they said. And it really just allowed me to put myself into the story and really immerse myself. And it was kind of disorienting at times. You know, you'd come out of a long day of writing about 1924, and you'd be like, whoa, what decade am I in? And you know, there was nothing more fun than going back and getting back into the past. And I like to say, you know, I'm in the business of time travel. You know, I love writing about crazy characters from history. You know, writing about them is the best next thing to having lived their lives. And I really had a lot of fun with this. I think I never had so much fun researching a book as I did with this one.
Asha was wondering if it's going to be made into a movie.
Oh, from your mouth to Hollywood's ears, you know. I say surprisingly only because I've had this. I think this is my most cinematic book in terms of being able to just see it play out on a screen, but it hasn't been optioned yet. I you know, fingers crossed. And you try not to think about that kind of thing too much, because there's really nothing you can do about it. It's totally out of your hands. And I've had things optioned, and they're optioned for a year, and then they're optioned for another year, and it just keeps being optioned. And the odds of anything getting made is so small that you really just try to say, oh, hey, that's fun to think about. It's a shiny object to put over here, but you can't really let it drive you nuts. So I'll let you know for sure if anything happens.
Yeah.
So.
And Giselle is wondering, the book describes widespread corruption at every level of government. Were there any particular facts that surprised you?
You know, Warren Harding and his Ohio gang would have a poker game frequently where, you know, the alcohol was brought in, Remus's alcohol. They were pretty open about that. Of course, Jess Smith was meeting with bootleggers all over the country, including George Remus. I thought that was quite astounding. Everybody was in it on every level. And I think that the brazenness, I was surprised with the brazenness with what they did it. They pretended to be dry, you know, anti-alcohol politicians, but everybody knew they were wet, and nobody really cared. And I think they got away with it for as long as they did because Prohibition was such an unpopular law, and everybody was drinking. So.
And Mary said she had the same thought. Karen, did you know before you started the depths of the corruption?
I mean, I had heard of Warren Harding's Ohio gang. They were sort of notoriously corrupt. And if you watch Boardwalk Empire, you also get, and I mentioned this in the book too, Warren Harding had a mistress that was quite scandalous, that she had a baby by him. There's also rumors that Warren Harding was murdered. So there were a lot of juicy, scandalous things going on in the Harding administration. And you kind of felt for Mabel Walker Willembrandt, who was just such a straight shooter. And she was often asked after her boss got in trouble, she was often asked if he had ever impeded her work. And she said, you know, whatever he did, he never impeded on my work. He never stopped me from prosecuting bootleggers. He never told me to lay off. So at least her boss was sort of straight with her.
Straight shooter. So Jane enjoyed the interview transcripts that were interspersed with the chapters. What gave you the idea for that?
It was part of the, you know, it was going through the trial transcript, and I thought, wow, this is such wonderful stuff. And it was testimony from characters who otherwise wouldn't make an appearance in the book. They weren't really major enough to warrant an appearance or becoming characters themselves. But their words were important. They were talking about George and Imogene Remus in important ways and in interesting ways, in ways that would increase the tension. And it was these trial transcripts that allowed me to really build up the idea of a whodunit, because at various points in the book, Imogene Remus wants to kill George, and George Remus wants to kill Imogene, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. And those trial testimony, I found really sort of bolstered that and let me have a lot of fun with it. So I'm glad you enjoyed that. It served its purpose.
Yeah. Anyone else have any questions that they want to ask? We can unmute you if anyone's. So Mabel Willembrandt,
yeah,
was her family anything? Like did she
no.
come from?
She had, you know, I thought the parallels between her and Remus were actually inverse parallels, if that's such a phrase, but she had quite an interesting background herself. You know, George Remus had to quit his formal schooling at age 13. She only began her formal schooling at age 13. She grew up in a Kansas plain, moving across various farms throughout the country. She often talked about the flash floods that they would suffer in their little tiny house, and her mother would sort of bring her up on the kitchen table to save her as the water swirled all around them. One of my favorite anecdotes of the whole book was with her father. She once bit a pet cat's ear, and to teach her a lesson, her father bit her ear back. You know, that's the kind of upbringing she grew up with. She was a brilliant person. Studied rigorously, studied as hard as Remus did to get into law school. She eventually ends up adopting a child on her own, which I think was quite rare for the time. And I love the fact that, you know, George Remus was this teetotaler who made money, all this money selling booze. And Mabel Walker Willembrandt was the Prohibition czarina, as Remus called her, the Prohibition enforcer. And meanwhile, this lady liked to have a drink. Before Prohibition, she was a big fan of California wines. She had gone to law school in California and really fell in love with her big red wines. And so she only quit drinking because she you know, had to follow the letter of the law because she got this job.
So Abbott, I'm going to tell you that Karen said this was such a great book and she learned so much from it.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Tell your friends. Word of mouth is the best thing for books. So thank you.
If someone hadn't read you before, which would you recommend of your other three to read next?
Oh my, it depends.
Do you have a favorite?
I don't have a favorite, but they're all so different. If you like something more similar to this, kind of a little hint of scandal, Sin in the Second City. It was about two sisters around the world's most famous brothel in Chicago in the early 1900s, and the sort of national culture war to shut them down. Liar, Tempter, Soldier, Spy. If you're into the Civil War, it's the story of four female Civil War spies and sort of the skullduggery they had to go through to try to help their cause, and including two amazing heroic women who I don't understand why they're why they're not household names. If it weren't for Elizabeth Van Leeuwen and Mary Bowser, two of the women I write about, I don't think that the North would not have won the war. So that, and the other one is Gypsy Rose Lee. It's not a biography, but it's I like to think of it as sort of a microcosm of 20th century America. I mean, she lived, her first performance was in the early 1900s, and she performed all the way up to Vietnam. And her true story is much darker and more interesting, I think, than anything she portrayed on Broadway. But that's my other three. So you could pick whatever your taste is. So. Do you mostly read nonfiction? I mostly read fiction, actually. I love narrative nonfiction. I like nonfiction that reads like a novel. I like nonfiction that's a story. So I try to write the kind of nonfiction that I like to read. So. What are you reading now? I am reading the new Elena Ferrante novel. Also a couple, my friend Eric Larson's new book, which I guess is not so new now, but I've saved it for the fall. It seems like a nice fall book for me. So. Yeah, I gotta read that. Yeah. Anyone else have a question? I just want to say, if something occurs to you later, feel free to email me. My email address is abbottauthor@gmail.com. My website is karenabbott.net. Happy to I do book clubs. Or just drop me a line, say hello, love to stay in touch. Thank you.
Abbott, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us. Yeah, thank you so much, Claire. You guys were a great group. Thanks for asking smart questions and for spending some time with me tonight. It was great. Thank you very much.